I'm Beaver Trapper in Birmingham, and in this segment of the show, I'm hopefully going to share with you lessons that I've learned in the School of Hard Knocks. Hello and welcome to the School of Hard Knocks. Tonight I'm going to talk about the collapse of the Soviet Union, and I'm going to compare and contrast the American system with the Soviet system and see if there's some lessons that can be learned by what the Russians went through. One of the most influential writers on this topic is a fellow named Dmitry Orlov. Orlov is a Russian who is very familiar with the collapse of the Soviet Union, and he's also lived in the West long enough to understand Western society and the differences between Soviet society and Western society. If you have a chance to read any of his material or pick up any of his books, I would strongly urge you to do so. I don't always agree with Orlov. He's a socialist at heart, and of course I'm not, but the man has some very valid real-life experience, and we can always learn from people regardless of whether or not we agree with them or not. One of Orlov's central theories is that the U.S. will collapse for precisely the same reason that the USSR collapsed, namely an unsustainable foreign debt load, unsustainable military spending, rising energy costs, and increasing social fragmentation or divergent primary loyalties. And what I mean by that is when people no longer consider themselves a Soviet citizen, but rather consider themselves a citizen of Belarus, then their primary loyalty has diverged from what it was. Just as in the United States, when people start to consider themselves Asian Americans, Hispanic Americans, or African Americans rather than Americans, then you have a divergence in primary loyalty. So I think we're seeing a lot of commonality between what caused the Soviet Union to collapse and what will cause the United States to collapse. Let's start by taking a look at what are some of the basic services that a government is expected to provide for its citizens, and let's look at how the Soviet government attempted to provide those versus how the United States government provides those. One of the salient features of an economic collapse in the Soviet Union was that people weren't paid for months at a time. People simply didn't get paychecks. There were shortages of food, shortages of gasoline, medicines, consumer goods were impossible to get, and crime skyrocketed. But despite the economic collapse, the Russian society in and of itself did not collapse when the economy did. And I think this is because of the nature of the socialist system that they lived under, and that people could survive without an income for an extended period of time. I think another interesting aspect is that the Soviet system was such an abysmal failure to begin with that the average Russian was used to living under systemic failure. By contrast, the American system has delivered a much higher standard of living, but this higher standard of living is dependent upon many interrelated parts of society functioning perfectly. The American system is a much more complex system and in many respects is less resilient in the face of a collapse. And therefore I think the average American is a lot less prepared for a collapse than the average Russian was. In short, I think that Orlov is correct when he says the collapse in the West is going to be a much harder, deeper collapse simply because we have farther to fall. The Russians were so bad off to begin with, they really didn't have that far to fall when everything fell apart, but we have a lot farther to fall. So let's talk about public transportation. In the Soviet Union, most people used public transportation. Very few people had cars. So they rode subways, they rode buses, what have you. All the government had to do after a collapse was to keep the trains and the buses running, and people could get around. People could conduct business. In the United States, we're car dependent. This requires a very complex supply chain to import oil, refine the oil into gas, transport the gas using gas, distribute the gas to gas stations, pump the gas into the cars using electricity, and then electricity to run the traffic lights and the road grid. And any break in that chain, any failure in the entire system means the whole thing can grind to a halt. So after a collapse, it was much, much simpler for the Russians to keep the wheels moving, so to speak, than it will be here in the U.S. All the Russians had to do was keep the buses and the subways going, and 80% of the people could get around to do what they needed to do. We have a much higher bar here. As far as housing is concerned, in the Soviet Union, most people lived in government-owned apartments. The government assigned you an apartment. They were rent-free. They sucked, but they were rent-free. The government provided the heat, the government provided the water, and all of the other services. Most of the time they didn't work, but it was free. And as a result, people in the Soviet Union could not be evicted. As long as they were alive, they had a place, a government-appointed, provided place to live. Now, it was no fun, it wasn't any good, it was small, it was cramped, it was poverty-stricken, it was like living in the projects, but they had a roof over their head, and it was free. Once the collapse occurred, nobody got evicted. There was no landowner to come say, pay your rent or get out on the street. In fact, most people assumed ownership of their apartments. So overnight, people became owners of the property that they existed in. They were squatting in, basically. Now compare that to the United States, where we live in houses that are many, many, many times nicer than a Soviet apartment. Your average suburban house is a castle compared to what the people in the Soviet Union had. But these houses are largely uninhabitable without electricity or natural gas or heating oil. You think about that. Your average suburban house down here in the South in the summertime, you cannot live in it without air conditioning. It's not designed to be habitable without air conditioning. You go up to the north and get into the winter, you've got to have heat of some sort. Our houses today are built out of cheap materials, the cheapest possible materials, and they won't last. They're not built to last, to be handed down from generation to generation. In Europe, you can buy a house that is 100, 200, 300 years old. You can't do that in the United States. It's simply not how it's done here. In addition, most people in the United States don't own their homes. They are making payments on a mortgage. The bank owns the home. Somebody else owns where most people live. Very few people own their homes outright. What this means is if there is a financial emergency, an economic collapse, monetary system in duress, people can be tossed out on the street en masse. We've seen that already with the mortgage crisis and how many people have suffered repossession, and how many people have been made homeless because they couldn't make the payments on their loans because they had variable interest rate loans. So that's a huge difference between having shelter when the Soviet Union collapsed versus having shelter when the United States collapses. Another thing to consider is the nature of business. If you're talking about before a collapse occurs, basically speaking, a large inventory is bad. A large inventory means that capital is tied up in materials that are basically sitting on a shelf gathering dust. It's inefficient. American businesses strive for a just-in-time inventory system that keeps as little inventory as possible on hand. We want it to come in the door when we need it and out the door as soon as we're done with it. In the Soviet Union, the just-in-time system didn't exist. The communist system simply wasn't efficient enough to support that sort of just-in-time inventory system. What this meant is most Soviet factories either didn't have inventory at all when they needed it, or they had way too much inventory. Now, once a collapse occurs, Inventory on hand is critical because your traditional supply chain mechanisms cease to function. You can almost think of on-hand inventory as preps for a business. American businesses do everything they can to avoid prepping. But the Soviet businesses prepped from day one because they really could never count on an efficient supply chain mechanism to begin with. So they had to hoard materials so that they would have the materials they needed to meet their industrial output production quotas. Another interesting difference is in the Soviet Union, huge state-owned factories were the centerpiece of life. Factories had cafeterias, they had showers, and sometimes they had dormitory areas. After the collapse, Russian workers would continue to show up to work at the factories for months without being paid. They could use public transportation to get there because they didn't have to have a car. They could eat one meal a day at the cafeteria, and many times that was the only meal that they got. There wasn't any food in the store. They didn't have any money to buy any food, but if the factory could barter for food, then the factory could supply the cafeteria and people could have soup and bread. And so workers would show up and work just to have that one meal. So this is one of the interesting ways that Russians went months without a paycheck, yet they had a roof over their head, they still showed up for work, and they got one meal a day. Another interesting thing to consider is the food production system. Basically, the food production system in the Soviet Union was a miserable failure. The USSR had to import grain from its enemies, namely the United States, and they had to borrow in order to buy the grain. They were literally borrowing money that they didn't have, that they couldn't pay back, to feed their people. Now, as a result of this failed system, people in the Soviet Union had to grow gardens. A basically underground supply chain developed to where people could grow produce, raise or catch meat, and they could barter amongst themselves or provide or supplement their diets for themselves. In other words, an alternative distribution channel for food came into existence. There were no such thing as fast food restaurants or drive-thrus or anything like that in the Soviet Union. When the government stores were empty, and most of the times they were, you ate at the factory or you had to make other arrangements and provide for yourself. So the Russian people were used to scrounging, and they were used to growing food in little areas inside of apartment complexes and what have you. In the United States, we're the breadbasket of the world. But almost everyone here gets food from the store. We're even seeing our own government criminalizing and arresting and jailing people for growing their own food and selling it outside of government supply chains or government-approved supply chains. They're arresting Amish people for selling raw or unpasteurized milk. If you live in a typical suburban neighborhood and you have a homeowners association, go try planting a garden in your front yard and see how long it takes until you end up in court being sued by your neighbors. They're making it to where you're a criminal if you try and provide for yourself on your own land. Another thing that's deplorable is you'd be shocked at how many people in this country are dependent upon fast food or takeout or microwave ready meals. The simple fact of the matter is most American women simply don't know how to cook from scratch anymore or don't have the time. They're too busy at a job working, trying to pay their bills, and they don't have time to cook. That has vast implications for a societal collapse or an economic collapse, because once the traditional supply chain of food breaks down, once you can't go to the store and buy microwave ready meals, once you can't pull up to McDonald's and get food through the window of your car, you're going to have to figure out how to actually cook. And you'd be shocked at how many people can't do that. And one of the last things that I want to touch on tonight is the societal implications. And this is something that I think we can learn a lot from the Russians. When the Soviet Union collapsed, the hardest hit segment of the population was middle-aged men. Middle-aged men were traditionally the head of the family, and they were the traditional breadwinners. Economic collapse destroyed their self-esteem. They were unable to earn money. They viewed themselves as failures, as helpless, as dependents, and that was a position that they were never used to being in. And middle-aged men in the Soviet Union turned to alcoholism in vast numbers. They also committed suicide in vast numbers, far greater than any other segment of society. And the bottom line from this is that economic collapse has a tremendous social cost. It destroys the social fabric of society. So anyway, I hope nobody thinks that this is some sort of pro-socialist or pro-Russian speech. It's not. But I firmly believe that if we don't know history, we're doomed to repeat it. And when we have an example that we can look to of what happened to a particular society when their economy collapsed, how did they handle it? What did they do right? What did they do wrong? How are they the same as us? How are they different from us? And what can we learn from that? We have a duty to be open-minded, and we have a duty to learn from it and not make the same mistakes as they did. So, I hope this has been of value, and until next time, have a good night.